Good morning and welcome to everybody who's just getting in. We are going to wait a few more minutes and let everybody get in from the waiting room, and then we'll start. Okay, it looks like everybody's in for now, and it's at the top of the hour. So I'd like to welcome all of you to our first AM 101 of 2022. Thank you for coming. Please keep your microphones muted and bear in mind that this session is going to be recorded. So everybody who registered will get a follow-up email with the link to the recording. You are more than welcome to share it with your colleagues, but this is basically a broad strokes introduction to the new RPA. So please do not share it with members. This is more so that you can understand the member experience with the RPA, since it's the most used form in the zipForm library. You can put your questions in the chat. Also, Gov will stop periodically to answer them. And with that, I'd like to introduce Gov Hutchinson, and he's going to do a broad overview of the new RPA for staff.
Yay. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Sharing my screen. There you go. The purchase contract. By the way, so I've been talking to Debbie, and I think she's going to try to schedule some more classes from the first quarter. And I really encourage all members to take it, because the 4-hour class is really, it doesn't just cover what's new, it covers the whole form, and it sort of puts everything in context. And I think starting in April or so, if any of you guys at that point want to do maybe a shorter thing, like equivalent to what we're doing today for your members, I'd be willing to do that. But for the first quarter, it's pretty much just focusing on the classes. And I'm super busy the first quarter anyway. And fingers crossed, I may take a vacation in March. How do you like that? So we'll see. Anyway, but for today, so I wanted to give you a big overview. Maybe some of you have taken the class or seen a big overview of the new form compared to the old form. To put it all in perspective, I mean, I've been doing this 36 years. When I started, that was the year the form went from 2 pages to 4 pages. Then a few years later, it went from 4 to 6. Then it went from 6 to 8. Then it went from 8 to 10. And it was on 10 pages for a long time. The feeling was on the forms committee, well, let's keep it at 10. If we're going to add something, let's take something else out, just keep it at 10. But I think the forms committee this go around, they basically said, you know, let's not worry about 10 pages. Let's put everything in this form they think would be helpful. Because we've learned over the last 10 years or so, some of the issues that keep coming up time and time again, that people argue about and fight about. So maybe if they were put into the contract, then it would solve problems. When they come up, rather than having an argument, it would actually be covered in the contract. So that was sort of the mindset, to put everything in the contract that would just help the transaction without thinking about how many pages that would be. Well, sure enough, it went from 10 pages to 16. But as I like to tell people, remember, I've been here for all these other transitions. The amount of substantive change to the form isn't really that great compared to previous changes. Like when I went from 6 to 8 or 8 to 10, there were a lot of significant changes. In this form, compared to the last one, it's more of just adding language. Like most of the paragraphs, virtually all the paragraphs that were in the old form are in the new form. They just have more stuff in them, more explanations of stuff. And that explains most of the increase from 10 pages to 16 pages. And the only real big conceptual change is, of course, this new paragraph 3 that you see, what this, and this goes on for 2.5 pages, paragraph 3, what it is previous to now, all of the so-called deal points were spread out through the form. What is a deal point? That's something that the buyer and seller can negotiate on. And what do they usually negotiate on? You know, like how much, what's the deadline, who's responsible? I mean, all those blanks have always been in the contract, but they've been spread out through the contract. And to tell you the truth, it's easy to miss them sometimes. So the thinking is everything, every blank that the buyer and seller are going to fill in, basically, other than in the first 2 paragraphs, let's put them all in one place. Let's put them all together so that, and those are the only things we're going to negotiate on. If it's not in paragraph 3, it's not really a negotiable point. It's more like information. But at least we know all in the same place where all the deal points are. And the way it's, I'll talk about it in more detail in a second. It's really laid out nicely. It starts off with all the buyers' deadlines, and then it has all the sellers' deadlines. So anyway, that's the big picture. Let me just go over some of this stuff. And there's one more thing I want to say as an introduction. There's one fundamental change. To me, it's almost the most important change in the whole form. As you know, in the course of an escrow, a transaction, buyers and sellers are constantly communicating with each other. They're sending things back and forth, which really means the agents are sending things. I mean, buyers and sellers don't send documents to each other. The buyer's agent sends documents to the seller's agent and vice versa on behalf of their clients. Because under agency law, delivery to the agent is legally delivery to the principal. Okay. So they send things back and forth. 36 years ago, believe it or not, they usually did it physically in person. But now, of course, everything is done electronically. So everything from I send you the offer, you send me the counter offer, the acceptance, I send you, here's a disclosure form, here's a contingency removal, here's a termite report, here's a prelim, here's a notice to perform. All these things go back and forth between the parties. And if you sense, there's always been an issue. If I send you something electronically, here's a disclosure form, here's an inspection report, here's a removal of contingency. So I email it to you. Well, when is that effective? It's effective. It's always been effective when you receive it. But believe it or not, that's always been an issue of what does it mean to receive an email? So if I send you an email in the middle of the night, 2 in the morning, and you're sleeping, have you received it if you're not even aware you've got it? Or I send you an email, it's in your inbox. Clearly, you know it's in your inbox, but you haven't opened it. Have you received it? That's never been clear. So for 35 years or so, I've been telling realtors, when you send an email, make sure you get an acknowledgement of receipt. Make sure you get a response from the other side saying, yep, got your email. Harass them to get that. Because if you don't get that, they could always say, I didn't get that email. I don't know what you're talking about. Always been an issue. Well, that issue is sort of gone because, as I will show you, the contract now, under the definitions paragraph, which is towards the end, paragraph 25. Okay, it talks about delivering something, because throughout the form, you deliver stuff, right? Like I said. So what does it mean to deliver something, deliver documents? It means, well, it's effective upon personal receipt. So if I send something to the buyer, the seller, or their agent, it's effective when they receive it. Great. Okay, we got that. So what does that mean to receive it? Well, it has 2 possibilities. Number one is a copy of the document or a link to the document is in the possession of that person. And that's sort of the way we've always done it. I send it to you. It's effective when you receive it, when it's in your possession. But remember, I just said, what does that mean that it's in your, what does it mean to say an email is in your possession? Does it mean it's in your inbox or you've opened it or whatever? Which is why here's the big change. There's an option now. Delivered also means an electronic copy of the document has been sent to the designated electronic delivery address specified in the broker section on page 16. So here's what happens now. So on the last page of the form, there's always been a place where the agents sign, right? So they still do, just as always. Buyers, they put their company name, their license number, their name, their license number. And the listing agent does the same thing, puts their name, license number. But here's the new thing. Each side is going to provide a designated electronic delivery address, which is typically an email. If they want to put a text, they can put a text. If they want to put more than one email, they can do that. If they want to just designate that one of them is the only one. The reason it's like this is because typically the MLS Connect auto-fills this with their email address and their text. But maybe the agent says, well, that's not the email address I want the other side to send things to. Maybe I'm even going to put my transaction coordinator's email. In other words, the agent can choose an email address that they want the other side to send documents to. It could be the one that's autofill. They can change that. They can have alternates. They can have a text, whatever. But let's say they just put one email address there. They're saying to the other side, if you want to send me anything, send it there. But based on what I just read you in the definitions, sending it constitutes delivery. So if I'm the buyer's agent and you've given me on the seller side your email, as soon as I press send, it is considered delivered. I don't have to prove that you received it. I simply have to prove that I sent it, which will hopefully stop the game playing. Well, I didn't get that email you said you sent me. I don't, it must have gone to spam. Or I didn't notice it in I never opened it. You may have sent it, I never opened it. That's not going to be an issue anymore. The issue is, well, you gave me an email address. I can prove that I sent it to that email address. Then I sent it. I legally sent it. And it doesn't matter whether you opened it or not. And you know what else? It doesn't matter if it went to spam. You should make sure you change your email filter so that things that come from me don't go to spam. So that's a significant change. Okay, that's a significant change. And so far, it seems to be working pretty well. Agents aren't complaining about it. Theoretically, an agent could leave this blank, in which case they're saying to the other side, we're not doing this. We're back to where we were before. If you want to send me something, you got to prove that I got it. And then we're back to when you send someone an email, you know, track them down and make sure they acknowledge that they got it, right? So that's sort of those are the two main sort of philosophical changes. All of the deal points are here, and delivery, sending it constitutes delivery as opposed to them receiving it. Or the definition of receiving it means you sent it to where they told you to send it to. Okay, so that's the big picture. Let me just go through a few of this stuff. You know, I'll go through big picture, some stuff that have changed or tweaked a little bit. I'll spend quite a bit of time in that paragraph 3. In paragraph 1, it's fundamentally the same. One little tweak is it used to say the real property is acquired. Now it just says the property, because now you can use this form to buy a mobile home. There's no longer a mobile home purchase contract. You just use this form. Similarly, there's no probate purchase contract anymore. You just use this for probates, okay? In the agency paragraph, which is a statutory requirement, the only change here worth mentioning is sometimes you hear about buyer's agent gives an agency form to the seller, seller's agent gives one to the buyer. I mean, on buyers, you're supposed to give an agency form to your own client, but then sometimes the other agent says, I need a copy of the agency form you gave to your client, which is not true. That's not a requirement, but they say it anyway. So for example, in 2A now it says buyer's agent's not legally required to give the seller's agent the AD form signed by the buyer. Seller's agent is not legally obligated to give the buyer's one. Just give to the buyer's agent the one they gave the client. That's an example of something that comes up time and time again. Rather than argue about it, the contract actually spells it out, right? So that's throughout this form, stuff like that. Now, so this grid here, all of these things in the grid used to be spread out throughout the form. They're now all in the same place, okay? And these are the basics, right? The purchase price. One change is when right next to where you put the price, you put all cash. It used to be, it was later in the form, you said it's a cash deal. Well, now it makes sense, right? Right up front, you're telling them it's a cash deal. Here's a change. Some of you guys have been around as long as me, or not as long as me, but you remember when the purchase contract used to be called the deposit receipt, right? Because a standard thing that happened was the buyer gave a check to the buyer's agent, and they signed the purchase contract partly as a receipt for that check, because typically buyer gives check to buyer's agent takes the money to the escrow company or the title company to open escrow. Well, look what it says here when it talks about deposit. It's going to be by wire transfer. I mean, that's most people have been doing anyway, but there's no longer even an option to use a check. So never are buyers going to be giving checks to their agents. Not many of them do it anyway anymore, but it's not even an option. So this is definitely not a deposit receipt anymore, because nobody's giving any check to the agent. Everyone agrees deposits are going to be done electronically. Okay, so that's sort of a nice change there. Then it gets into the loan stuff. By the way this grid works, all of this stuff, it starts off with are buyer things, buyer deadlines. Okay, buyer, how much are you offering? When do you want to close? How long is your offer good for? How much is your deposit? Are you going to do an increased deposit? If so, you got to attach a form. Oh, you're getting a loan? Tell us about your loan. Right? So this is all buyer stuff. Buyer promises, buyer requests, buyer deadlines. Okay. There's one little, and here's a deadline, for example. If you're an FHA or VA buyer, you have to deliver a list of lender required repairs within 17 days. In the old form, that was late, that came later in the form, but now that's part of the loan situation. So it's a buyer deadline. And occupancy type. Are you going to live there, buyer, or not? In the old form, you had to wait till like paragraph 9 to find out if the buyer was going to live there, because that's a negotiable item. Are you going to live there, or you're not going to live there? Now, right up front, the buyer is saying, yeah, I'm going to live in the house, or I'm not, or it's an investment, or it's my second home, or it's an investment property. So most of the stuff isn't new. It's just new that it's all together. Then you put the down payment. Then we're still going with the buyer asking for stuff. This is a new thing where the buyer can ask for a seller credit right up front. Usually you negotiate a credit when you're in the middle of escrow and the buyer says, hey, I want you to fix this. And seller says, I'm not going to fix it. How about I just credit you $1,000? But sometimes the buyers actually right up front in the offer ask for a seller credit for like closing costs or something. There was never a place to do that. Now there is. That's nice. I like this part. Buyer, if you're a cash buyer, you have to provide proof that you have the cash. If you're not a cash buyer, you're getting a loan, you have to provide a proof of your down payment. And if you're a loan buyer, you also want to provide proof to the seller that you're pre-qualified. You have some letter from the lender saying this person's pre-approved or pre-qualified. Believe it or not, these three things before were spread out. I like the fact they're all together now because they're all sort of similar things. And it reminds the buyer, you you got 3 days to do this. Actually, you should attach it to your offer, or worst case, you have 3 days. So in other words, these are related deadlines, and buyer has, it's the same deadline for each one, or it's better yet, it's actually attached, right? And there's a new option here, because a lot of buyers now, to make their offer look good, they're actually getting loan approval. They're not just getting pre-qualified or pre-approved, they're getting final approval before they even write the offer. So that's that's an option they have now. Paragraph J is the walkthrough. Every buyer has an opportunity, typically within the last 5 days of escrow, to come take one last look at the property before they close. In the old form, this is in paragraph 16. Well, now that's a deadline, right? I mean, that's a negotiable deadline. At what point does the buyer get their walkthrough? So it's put up here. This K is a new thing. Question comes up, can a buyer assign their interest to somebody else? The answer is yes, with seller's approval. Seller has to be reasonable. Here's a new thing. You now have a deadline to request this. Never used to have a deadline. Then we get to the all-important contingencies. For 30 years, I've been telling realtors, the buyers have 8 contingencies. They have 8 ways to get out of the deal. But did you know these contingencies up until this form were spread out? There were a couple in paragraph 3, 1 in paragraph 4, 1 in paragraph 8, 2 in paragraph 12, and 1 in 13. Well, now all the contingencies are together. That might be my favorite thing about the whole new form. And they all have the same deadline. You can negotiate this number. Those of you in the Bay Area know typically buyers now are making non-contingent offers. They typically remove these contingencies with the offer. But that's not true everywhere, or it's true someplace. But anyway, the point is, if you're not removing your contingency with your offer, they all have the same 17-day deadline, which you can, of course, negotiate. And it clearly explains what are the 8 ways a buyer can get out of a deal. They don't get the loan, it doesn't appraise, they investigated, didn't like what they found, they're reviewing documents the seller gave them, don't like them, don't like the prelim, don't like something in the HOA docs, don't like the solar lease, or their offer's contingent on selling their own house first. And explains how that contingency doesn't get removed. There's no deadline to remove that contingency, but it's nice graphically to see that, right? This clearly tells the buyer, oh, that contingency I don't have to remove in 17 days. Anyway, so I like this fact. And if, by the way, if a buyer does want to make an offer with no contingencies, it explains how to do that. If you don't want a loan contingency, check the box. If you don't want an appraisal contingency, check the box. If you want to remove any of these other contingencies in your offer, it explains. You have to attach an addendum, the contingency removal addendum. So I like how that's all laid out nicely. So these are all sort of the buyer promises and buyer deadlines, right? How much am I paying? When am I closing? What's my deposit? How much of a loan am I trying to get? Am I going to live there? Am I asking for a credit? I'm going to give you the pre-approval and the proof of cash. Here's what I want to walk through. Here's my deadline for assignments. And these are when I'm going to remove all of my contingencies. These are all buyer deadlines, buyer promises. Then we come to sort of the seller's obligations. The first seller obligation is when does the seller have to make the property available to the buyer? In other words, when does the buyer get to move in? First question is, what time of day do they move in? The second question is, what day they move in? So the time of day, you can agree the moment it records, I get to move in, or 6 o'clock, or whatever. But that doesn't tell you what day I get to move in. Then we get down here. If you're buying a seller-occupied property or it's vacant, I get to move in either on the closing day or some other day. whichever we choose. What time of day do I get to move in on that day? That's this one. Whatever time we agreed on whatever day we agreed on, that's when I get to move in. You're basically saying to the seller, that's when you have to be out. That's when you have to make the property available. Then there's one new addendum. There's only one brand new addendum that everyone's going to use. It's called the tenant occupied property addendum. Let's say you're buying a house and there's, at the time of the acceptance of the offer, there's a tenant in the property. Well, is that tenant going to move out? Are they going to move out before close? Are they going to move out at close? Are they going to stay after close? What's up with the tenant? On the old form, you had to write it in on the contract what happened with the tenant. There's now a brand new form, tenant occupied property addendum. And that's the form that talks about the tenant. So if you're writing an offer on a property with a tenant, you're going to have to use this form to talk about what do you want, do you want to let the tenant stay, or maybe the listing agent's already told you the tenant wants to stay another week after close or something. And then you'd incorporate into that, or they'd counter you, however you want to deal with it. The point is there's now an addendum to deal with the tenant. You no longer have to write it in on the contract. It's an addendum. Okay. And then these are more seller deadlines. What is the seller's deadline to deliver stuff to the buyer? And that means everything, the disclosure forms, the prelim, the termite report, if they're doing one, the HOA documents, the previous buyer's inspections, any document that the seller has to give to the buyer. What is the deadline to do it? And the answer is 7 days. Now, once again, it's fairly common, at least in the Bay Area, and it's becoming common other places, is some sellers like to put together all their documents and make them available to buyers before the buyers even write their offer. They post them on a website, a package. They usually call it a disclosure package, where the buyer can actually access all of the seller documents before they even write the offer, which I think is a great practice, but that's not everywhere. So if you're not, on the seller side and the listing side, if you're not doing that, the contract says, seller, your deadline to make sure the buyer gets all this stuff is 7 days. You have another deadline, you got 3 days to order the HOA docs. The smart listing agent orders the HOA docs before they even put the house on the market, because the HOAs notoriously take too long in providing the documents. Here's a new thing, by the way. On the previous form, the seller's deadline to install smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors was close of escrow. Now it's 7 days. So that's sort of a new seller deadline, or an earlier seller deadline. And the other thing that's sort of a new thing is, and this applies to the buyer or the seller. Let's say the buyer or the seller is not a person, it's a corporation. My buyer is a corporation or a trust or an LLC or a partnership. So the buyer or the seller is not a person, it's a thing. Well, how do you know the person who's signing on behalf of the buyer or the seller is the right person? If it's a trust, how do you know they're the trustee? If it's a corporation, how do you know it's the president? If it's a partnership, how do you know it's the managing partner? Well, who's ever signing the form has a 3-day deadline to provide evidence that they are the person with authority to sign on behalf of the entity. So I like that. All this, and that's a buyer. So that's sort of a buyer and seller deadline. So I like all these deadlines are all together. There's no mystery about when do I have to do this or that. I can always go back to this paragraph to remind myself, oh yeah, what was my deadline again? Because they're all together. Okay. Here's another new thing. When you buy a house now, there's all sorts of things that come with the house, like video doorbells, security equipment, mirrors, electric car charging systems, jacuzzis, wine coolers. And the question always is that thing staying with the house, or is the seller going to take that with them? Does it belong to the house, or does it belong to the seller? And a lot of times people assume, oh, video doorbell, of course, belongs to the house, where the seller thinks, well, of course, that's my video doorbell. I'm going to take it with me. So they end up fighting about it at close of escrow. Well, now all of these items are right here. So when you're writing your offer, buyer, if you want any of this stuff, just check the box. And if the seller doesn't want to give it to you, they're going to counter you. But there's not going to be you've at least addressed it in the contract. So you're not going to have an argument at close of escrow when you show up and say, where's the jacuzzi? Where's the electric car station? Where's the wine cooler? And the seller says, it's mine. That's where it is. I took it. Well, no, I thought it was part of the house. No, you see that, you resolve it. So that's a good thing. Then they have there's the list of all the things that you have to decide who's going to pay for this. Who's going to pay for the NHD report? Who's going to pay for those smoke alarms? If I live in a city like LA where there's like a 9A report or a mandatory plumbing upgrade, who has to pay for that? Who's paying escrow? Who's paying title? Who's paying transfer taxes? Who's paying HOA fees, etc. So this is not new, but what's new is now there's an option to say both. Maybe you're going to split it. Maybe not the same one is going to pay for it. Maybe you're going to negotiate that. So that's a slight difference. And there's mentions here that HOAs now charge a move-out fee or a move-in fee, and that's going to be, buyer always pays the move-in fee, seller always pays the move-out fee, regardless of what else you say. And there's more explanation, because that's an issue that comes up sometimes. Okay. And another issue that comes up, those of you in Northern California may have heard this, that if the buyer is paying for the title policy, then the buyer gets to choose who the title company is. In Southern California, typically the sellers pay for title, so you can negotiate who the title company is. Typically in Northern California, the buyer pays for the title. And you know, this is the only thing in the contract that's non-negotiable. If a buyer is paying for title, then by law, if they choose the title company, the seller can't counter it. That's interesting. And they've simplified a couple of things here. The HOA fee used to be broken down. Part of the HO fee, buyer pays, part seller pays, part you negotiate. Now they said, let's make it simple. Let's just say the seller pays all the HOA fees for disclosures, and the buyer pays the lender fee, rather than break it down into more categories. Okay. All right. So that's the big paragraph 3. And once you finish that, there's nothing else to negotiate. The danger, of course, is we're worried that clients are just going to read paragraph 3. That's all I need to read. I don't need to read anything else, because all the explanations and all the other promises come later. But nevertheless, at least it's all in one place, all the negotiable items. Okay. Now, paragraph 4 is where you attach stuff. Remember I said that there's a new tenant addendum? So 4A are new addenda. There are 5 brand new addenda that come with this form that weren't around before. As I said, the tenant occupied addendum is going to come up a lot. Every single time you buy a house with a tenant, that's got to be checked. You heard me say a while ago, there's no more probate purchase contract. There's no more mobile home purchase contract. So if you're doing a probate or a mobile home, you're going to check these boxes and attach the probate addendum, or a manufactured home addendum. Another 2 more new forms are, we're starting to see throughout California, situations where instead of just buying a fee simple interest, instead of getting a deed, you're just becoming a tenant in common. You're getting a tenant in common interest in a property. So now we have an addendum for that. And then another one is sometimes we've seen now you don't get a deed. The property is owned by a co-op. So what you're actually buying when you buy it is instead of getting a deed, you get a certificate of shares in the co-op. So we have an addendum for that too. So these are the 5 new addenda. Okay. Then these other addenda are traditional. And then we have advisories that are pre-checked and pre-attached. These aren't required by law, and they don't have to be signed. And it mentions now it's not part of the contract, but to protect the realtors, C.A.R. has attached these addenda so that your clients can't come back and say, why didn't you tell me about the fair housing rules? Why didn't you tell me about the privacy rule? Why didn't you tell me about wire fraud? Well, we did tell you. We gave you the form. It was attached to the contract. With their other advisories we think are good, but we're sort of leaving it to the realtor to decide if they want to give them to their client. Because sometimes they say, I've given my client enough paperwork. I don't want to give them any more paperwork, even though I understand that it probably helps me as a realtor. But C.A.R. has made the decision, realtor, we're not even going to let you decide. These 4 advisories are so important to protect you, the realtor, we're going to force you to give them to your clients, right? And that's not new. Paragraph 5 is sort of just sort of explanatory stuff about the loan. If you're getting a loan, most of it is not new. There's one significant thing here that seems to be working okay is look at C3 here. Buyer is now authorizing the seller and their agent to contact their own lender. You know, the buyer's trying to get a loan, right? And you're going through escrow and they still haven't got loan approval yet. The sellers want, you got loan approval yet or not? Look at this. The form now gives the seller permission to contact the buyer's lender to determine the status. So that's an interesting change. Another one here is if you're an FHA buyer, you now have a new requirement. You have to tell the seller if the FHA or VA buyer is requiring certain repairs to be done, or you have to tell them if there aren't any lender requirements. You got to tell them either way. It used to be you only had to tell the seller if there were required lender was requiring certain repairs. Now you got to tell the seller either way. I mean, so you see, there are little things like that that people need to be aware of, which is why I tell people take the whole class so we can point out all the little things. But, and these aren't negotiable points. These are things that the contract now says, right? And there are a few of these. Continuing along, let's say once you close the deal, here's sort of a nice change that people like. The escrow closes and the seller leaves and they leave their crap behind. They leave stuff behind. What does that mean? By leaving it behind, are they saying that, buyer, it's now yours? Or are they saying, oh, I forgot it, I guess I'll have to come back and get it? In other words, what does it mean to leave stuff behind? Well, I like this, what it says now. It says, unless otherwise agreed, all debris and personal property not included in the sale shall be removed at the time the buyer moves in. If items are not removed, all items shall be deemed abandoned. In other words, seller, if you didn't take it with you, we presume you don't want it. And the buyer just has to give the seller 3 days warning. You know what? You left your stuff behind. If you don't get it in 3 days, it's gone. Plus, you weren't supposed to leave stuff behind, so I can sue you for the cost of removing it. So it's trying to give the seller some incentive. Don't leave crap behind when you sell. Clean it up, or you can get sued. And by leaving it, if you accidentally left something of value behind, too bad. You got 3 days to come and get it. Otherwise, you've abandoned it. So buyer can do it. Buyer can keep it, sell it, throw it away, do whatever they want. Okay. So that's a nice little change. I think people are pretty happy with that one. Nothing too significant there. Here's some good, more explanations about the contingencies. Here's a new thing. A lot of you know throughout California, it's so difficult to get fire insurance now. It costs a lot of money. So now in A2, it reminds the buyer, you need to investigate this, and you need to investigate it early. Traditionally, buyers didn't check out insurance until the deal was about to close because everybody got insurance. It always costs about the same. But now it's hard to get it. Sometimes it costs a lot. So this is reminding the buyer, check that out early before you remove your contingency, because you know what I mean? I mean, you may find out the insurance is so costly that may change your decision on buying the property at all. So that's a nice little thing. There are a few more little things like there. Talks about appraisals. It just sort of explains the contingencies a little bit. Here's a new thing. Sometimes now, title companies, they give you a preliminary title report. The buyer looks at it, the buyer says, okay, they remove their contingency. And then later on in escrow, the title company provides a revised prelim. This points out that when that happens, if there's anything on the revised prelim that's different, it's material or substantial deviations, buyer has a new way to get out of the deal. This was never addressed in the contract before because it rarely happens, but it does happen. So the question is, even though I've removed all my contingencies, if I get a revised prelim that's different, I can still get out of the deal. It's sort of like I have a new contingency to do that. Okay. This is sort of basic explanations here. By the way, it mentions on what an issue that comes up a lot is buyer gets an appraisal. Do they have to give a copy of the appraisal to the seller? And agents argue about this. Now the contract actually says, no, you don't, unless it's a FHA or VA appraisal. A normal appraisal, you don't have to give a copy to the seller. That's just an example of something that's clarified in the contract that used to come up before. Item 9 talks about what's included in the sale, has some nice things. The contract has always said window coverings are included. Then people say, well, do window coverings include the blinds? Do that include curtains and drapes? Does that come with the house, or does the seller get to keep those? Well, son of a gun, we have a definition. Window coverings does include blinds, curtains. So seller, you're supposed to leave that behind or negotiate back in that other paragraph. And you got to leave pool equipment. Pool equipment belongs to the house. Well, what does pool equipment mean? Well, now look at it says. It includes the motorized pool cleaner and the nets and covers. Just an example of putting more stuff in here so that people don't argue later. Where are the curtains? You're supposed to leave the curtains. No, I don't have to do that. Yeah, the contract says you're supposed to leave window coverings. Well, that's not a window covering. Those are curtains. Argument. And when that happens, realtor usually buys the curtains, right? Once again, this contract is full of things where they've now explained definition of window coverings, definition of a security system. It includes light bulbs, for example. So this particular paragraph has more information about what is included in the sale, and what isn't included. Certain things are not included, flat screen TVs, et cetera, okay? Paragraph 10, just more explanations of, these point of sale inspections. One thing that comes up sometimes is, well, let's say I'm in a city where my city has a mandatory plumbing upgrade. And who's going to pay for that? Well, and we decided back in paragraph 3, let's say that the buyer is going to pay for it. Well, if the buyer is going to pay for it, how does that actually work? And this paragraph now actually explains, well, buyer, if you're going to pay for it, buyer, you have to put funds into escrow, or you're going to pay the vendor directly. Maybe that was assumed before, but it was never spelled out. If the buyer's paying for something, how does that physically happen? I mean, if the seller is going to pay for it, obviously the seller just pays for it. But if the seller is responsible for it, but the buyer is going to pay for it, how does the buyer give the money to the seller to pay for it? And now that's explained. This is an example of more explanations. Paragraph 11 has all the disclosures. The explanations have been beefed up slightly. I don't need to get into the nitty-gritty with you. Like a big picture item that comes up a lot is seller gives all the disclosures to the buyer. Buyer's okay with them. Buyer removes their contingencies. Then halfway through escrow, the seller learns of something else. How do they communicate that to the buyer? And does that give the buyer the right to get out of the deal? In other words, the buyer has removed all their contingencies. They no longer have a right to cancel, but new information has arisen. Does that give the buyer the right to cancel? And the answer, of course, is it depends. What was that new information, and did it come from the seller or did it come from the buyer's inspector? Do you know if the buyer's inspector discovers something, or if the buyer discovers something after they've removed their contingencies, the buyer can't get out of the deal? They should have discovered it before they removed their contingencies, which is why when people make non-contingent offers, it can be risky, because you think you've investigated everything about the house, and then you find out something really important in the middle of escrow. Too bad, buyer, you can't get out of the deal because you've removed your contingency. Anyway, and there's also a new contingency, as most of you know by now from listening to me over the last year and a half. There's the fire hardening and the defensible space. That's a new disclosure form. It's a new law, and that's now in the contract. Obviously, it wasn't there before because it wasn't required. And this talks about the fact that when you get these disclosures, even if they come in late, you still have 5 days to cancel, regardless of the contingencies. It's always difficult to explain to people, buyers, you can get out of a deal based on your contingencies, but you can also get out of a deal. You have a 5-day right of rescission after receiving these disclosures. Typically, though, those 5 days are gone before they've removed their contingencies. But the interaction between contingencies and a statutory right to cancel is an issue, and it's explained a little bit better here in this paragraph 11, I think. And there's a new disclosure, okay? Paragraph 12 is just like paragraph 12 in the old form, just talks about home inspections, what you can inspect, what you can't inspect. Without seller's consent, you can't do anything invasive or destructive other than termite report. They added something, but even if it's a termite report, you can't drill holes through stucco. Okay, great. Talks about when buyers do inspections, they have to give copies of the inspections to the seller at no cost. That's spelled out now. Paragraph 13 on the prelim. It talks about preliminary title records, also talks about what type of title insurance policy are you going to get. Just like the old form, it says buyers are going to get a particular policy called the homeowner's policy. Well, what if that's not available? In the old form, it said, well, then you'll figure out what policy you want if that one's not available. Now the form says, if that policy is not available, the buyer's going to get a different policy. So there's a second choice. There's first choice, second choice. In the old form, it was just first choice. And if that's not available, we have to figure out which one we want. So that's a slight change. There's a new thing here. I don't know if any of you guys have heard about in certain counties. If the buyer's not a person and it's an all cash deal over 300, which means pretty much everywhere, there's a particular federal law that requires title companies to report to the Department of Treasury who the real buyers are. And this is just telling buyers about that law. Then paragraph 14 gets to the all-important, it comes up all the time, of course. What if the buyer doesn't do what they said they're going to do? Or what if the seller doesn't do what they said they're going to do? Under what circumstances can the buyer cancel the seller? And under what circumstances can the seller cancel the buyer? And this paragraph has sort of been restructured to really make it clear. I really like it. It says all in one place. These are the situations when a seller has the right to cancel. In other words, if the buyer misses any of these obligations or they don't remove their contingencies, it's all spelled out. In other words, seller says to their agent, can I cancel the buyer because they didn't do whatever? And you look, well, let's see. Yep. Right here is, they didn't do what they said right here. Yes, says right here, you can cancel. Same thing on the buyer's side. When does the buyer have the right to cancel? And it explains it, the three sort of categories when a buyer can cancel. And then it talks about before you can cancel, you have to give to the other side a warning. It's called a notice to perform. This makes it clear that this warning has to be at least 2 days, and you can't give them the warning more than 2 days before the deadline. And this talks about deposits, the all-important question, the deal canceled, do I got to give the buyer back their deposit or can I keep the buyer's deposit? How does that all work? And that's explained here. I mean, I could talk for an hour on just that one issue, explaining all the details, but it does sort of explain it in rough terms to the clients. What does it mean to remove your contingencies? And what if the other side just simply doesn't close on time? Well, how do I deal with the other side not closing on time? And it talks about, we have a form called demand to close. It now says you got to give them at least 3 days. And after 3 days, you can cancel them. Well, do I get their deposit then? It depends. Talks about it here. The rest of the form is almost identical to the old form. Repairs have to be done before the walkthrough. You get a walkthrough. You're going to prorate certain things. I mean, there are slight little changes in some of these. Not really worth mentioning at this point for you guys. Talks about when do I get paid and what documents determine when I get paid. This is a very important one, 18B. It explains to the clients all the things the realtor is not responsible for. Checking permits, checking the boundary lines, measuring square footage. This is a great thing. This really protects the realtors. Nothing new there. 19 is you're talking to the escrow company or the title company. You're telling them things. The clients are promising to give documents to escrow within a certain time. You got to return those. When the title company or the escrow company gives you something to sign, you got to sign and return it. How long do I have to do it? Well, remember, that's a deal point. So it's back in paragraph. I'll tell you what it says back in paragraph 3. It says 5 days. But it explains things. I mean, you have obligations to the title company and the escrow company. Talks about the agents are not party to the deal, but escrow can't close without the agents getting paid. There's new stuff. A lot of this stuff we put in here in this paragraph at the request of the title companies and the escrow companies. They're saying, you know, sometimes we need an invoice or something to process something, and the clients or the agents are just blowing us off. They're not doing it. So it talks here that, for example, you're going to give things to escrow within 3 days. And for example, the buyer and seller acknowledge that escrow holder may require invoices. Upon request, you're going to give it to them in 3 days. And if you miss that deadline, the other side can cancel you. These are serious deadlines. Escrow and title have serious deadlines. Nothing has changed here. Agents aren't guaranteeing the performance of referrals. MLS. There's a new thing in the MLS. There's new language here telling the clients that these images, these pictures of the house that are on the MLS, they can't be removed. Because the buyers sometimes say, all right, closed escrow now. I want all these pictures of the house taken off the internet. Number one, the MLS can't do it. And number two, they're not even allowed to do it if they could. And that explains that. Assignments, this has been beefed up a little bit. It basically, I sort of mentioned this before. Buyers now have a deadline to request an assignment. It also points out that if a buyer wants, so if you want to assign your interest to somebody else, you need the seller's permission. But you got to ask in 17 days. After that, seller can just say no. It's not a question of permission. During the first 17 days, the seller can only deny the buyer's request if it's reasonable. Maybe they don't like the assignee or something like that. That's reasonable. And then it also points out if the buyer wants to assign their interest to their own trust or their own corporation, they don't need the seller's permission. They can do it anytime they want. Definitions, as I told you, they're pretty much the same as they've always been, with the very important thing: the definition of delivery is now, if I sent it, it's considered delivered. I don't have to prove that you received it, because personal receipt means it was sent. So no longer is it the burden on the sender to prove that the recipient received it. If you gave me your email address and I can prove I sent it to that email address, you can't deny that you received it. If I sent it, you've received it. Very important. Terms and conditions, no change. Time of the essence. Some of you may have heard that if you're signing on behalf of, if you're a trustee signing on behalf of a trust, or a president signing on behalf of a corporation, there used to be this addendum called the Representative Capacity Signature Addendum. That's gone. Now that's just called the legally authorized signer. And as I mentioned before, they have 3 days to provide proof that they are the right person. The liquidated damages and arbitration, these are paragraphs where this is actually another negotiable point, right? So this is sort of the only negotiable thing that's not in paragraph 3. What's negotiable here is, do you want liquidated damages to be part of the contract or not? Do you want arbitration to be part of the contract or not? If you initial it, you're saying you want it. If the other side initials it, they agree with you. But if the buyer says, yeah, I want all disputes to be resolved through arbitration, and they initial it, and the seller says, I don't agree with that, and they don't initial it, that's a counteroffer. You have to keep negotiating. This is at the very end now. The buyer is about to sign it. If the buyer is a thing, not a person, they're going to check this box, and they're going to put the name of the person who's signing as opposed to the name of the entity. Then they sign it. Either the buyer's signing it or the legally authorized signer is signing it. Seller, same thing. seller's going to sign it. If it's a counter offer, they're signing it subject to a counter offer. If it's a backup offer, they're going to sign that. If the seller is a thing, the seller's a trust, a corporation, an estate, they're going to check this box, write down who the right person is, and they're going to sign it. And then the very last page is the all-important place where the brokers put their name. They also put it on the first page, on the agency paragraph. But once again, you're going to put your company's name, your company's DRE number. There's room for 2 agents because a lot of agents work as partners now. They can put both their names. What if there's more than 2? Well, you can check a box and add an additional agent acknowledgement. Sometimes there are 2 brokerages representing the same person. You can attach that form. Here's the all-important new thing. I am putting my email address here. I can put a text if I want to. So I am telling the other side, this is where you send stuff. Sometimes agents have their own email address and they want you to have that, but they don't want you to send documents there. Maybe they want you to send documents to their transaction coordinator or whatever. So they could put down an alternative. Sometimes they have more than one. So they're saying, send it either way. I'll check both. Or they're going to say, no, I just want you to send documents to this one. So this is all important of how you fill that out. Okay. And then at the very end, you give a copy to the escrow company or title company for them to fill it out. I always point out at the very bottom here, you have an ethical obligation now. Obviously, you've always had an ethical obligation to present all offers. But now you have an ethical obligation if you're the listing agent and the buyer's agent asks you and they say, did you present my offer? Of course I did. Well, tell me when you presented my offer. And if the buyer's agent asks you that, the listing agent is required under penalty of perjury to say, yes, I presented your, I mean, it's not penalty of perjury, it's code of ethics, it's not law. But under ethical obligation, you have to actually tell the buyer when you presented it, and this is where you can do that. You only have to fill this in, though, if the buyer's agent actually asks you to. But if they ask you to, you have to. One other thing that comes up is, do sellers have to respond to offers? No. Sellers can accept an offer, counter an offer, or just ignore it. But we always tell agents, make the buyer happy, make the buyer's agents happy. If the seller isn't going to accept the offer or they're not going to counter it or accept it, it would be a nice thing to do to initial it saying, well, we didn't accept your offer. But at least they're acknowledging that they got it. That's not required by law, though. Okay. All right. I went a couple minutes over. It looks like no questions in the chat. You all have my email. You can all email anytime. Obviously, you probably shouldn't be the one answering questions for your members on the contract, but Peggy and I wanted you to have at least an overview of what they're dealing with. As you can tell, there's a lot to it. I recommend, once again, it's really worth the 4 hours to go through this, because when I do the 4 hours, I go through everything. I cover it all. They're going to know, and I cover some of the other forms as well. But as I said, starting in April, we're going to have time if you're interested. A couple of associations I already sort of agreed to do this. I wasn't supposed to, so I'm not going to mention those lucky associations, or just like 1 or 2 of them. Anyway, that are doing this before April. Anyway, but starting in April, if you can't convince your members to take the really good 4-hour class that I teach, or Neil teaches, or Janet teaches, which is really worth it, we are going to start offering like 1.5 hours, or sort of what I just did for you, which it doesn't cover everything, but maybe that's just someone thinks that's all they need, or maybe they took the class and they want a refresher. So we'll be offering that, but not until April. If it's not already on your schedule, then don't ask me until April. Like I said, I'm taking a vacation anyway, so fingers crossed, right? It doesn't get canceled because of what's going on. But anyway, so, okay, Peggy.
Okay, Gov, before we end, Bob Hart has a question. Bob, can you unmute yourself and ask Gov?
Hey, good morning, Gov.
Hi, Bob.
We're having an issue where a team member writes an offer only having their one name on the form originally, and then just before the close, they give an additional agent addendum saying, we want these 7 or 8 people all to be showing they were involved in this transaction.
Yeah.
And a seller saying, I don't want to sign that. I've never heard of these people. I don't know anything about them. Why would I sign off on this?
Right.
Any recommendations on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. To tell you the truth, it's not that big of a deal. In other words, so we're at this last, so your scenario is when they wrote the offer, they only put one name here. And that's who the seller knows. And then at the end, they want, instead of doing what they should have done, which is attaching this AAA form at the beginning with all 7 members, they're trying to get it now. But if you really think about it, what difference does it really make? I mean, why should the buyer's agent really care if the seller signs it or not? I mean, it doesn't affect anything. If it's a question of commission, money, that's internal in the buyer's agent's office. The seller has nothing to, whether the seller acknowledges that these other agents were quote unquote working on the deal or not, that in no way affects their right to get paid. That's determined within the buyer's agent's office. What about liability? Well, same thing. I mean, if you're a real estate licensee and you worked on the deal and you screwed up, you're going to have liability whether the seller signs something acknowledging that they were aware that you were working on the deal or not. It really doesn't matter. I've sort of wondered about, I hear that sometimes too. And I will say, what do you care? Why, what seller doesn't really matter. If I were talking to the seller, I'd say, why do you not want to sign? It doesn't really matter. It doesn't change your life. And if I was talking to the buyer's agent, I'd say, why do you really care? I mean, maybe it's an internal thing, you have to show your broker that they were on the deal, and so to get paid or something. Well, you don't really need the seller's signature to do that. You don't need the seller to acknowledge, because the seller doesn't know who's working behind the scenes anyway. So I just think it's a big non-issue. That doesn't solve your problem if people are going to argue about it. But all I can say is it doesn't really matter. Whether you sign it or not is not going to change anything. So in a perfect world, yes, it's nice to have it all together. And an issue that comes up sometimes is if you put your name on the original offer, you're telling the other side, I'm working on this deal, you can contact me. But that's sort of gone now, because now you designate how to contact me. You give an email address. And the email address could be the email of one of the team members' job is to accept documents. So in other words, hopefully that answered. The point is, it's not a big deal. And I don't know how else to handle other than saying nobody has to sign that. And if they don't, it doesn't affect the validity of the offer. I mean, even if they attach it with the original offer and the seller doesn't sign it, it doesn't affect, they still have a binding contract. It doesn't matter. So there you go.
Perfect answer. I'll just be able to say, Gov says it doesn't matter.
Yeah, Gov says it doesn't matter. Quote me on that one.
I will. Perfect.
All right,
Thank you.
good. All right.
All right, good to go. Gov, thank you so much. That was a really great, more than a broad overview, honestly. So nice for everybody to know kind of what our members are going through with the new form and whatnot. Certainly not train the trainer, so be careful what you answer when they ask you. But Gov, thank you very much. That was really terrific. And thanks everybody for coming. I'll send a follow-up email as soon as the video is posted to our YouTube channel.